Hey everybody, welcome back to the Texas Legacy Support Network Show, Season 1, Episode 12. My guest today is a man that was not only a witness to some of the greatest moments in University of Texas athletics, but played an important role in chronicling those moments. I will introduce you to Professor Larry Carlson right after this.
Our last game, Friday Night Legends, was a big hit, and now you can play the greatest college football teams of all time against each other. Before now, if you wanted to see the 2019 LSU Tigers play the 2001 Miami Hurricanes squad, you were stuck with only your imagination. Not anymore. This new game allows you to play those dream matchups. 1945 Army Black Knights, considered by many to be the greatest team in the history of college football. 2014 Ohio State Buckeyes, featuring Ezekiel Elliott, head coach Urban Meyer, and offensive coordinator Tom Herman. 2005 Texas Longhorns knocked off number 1 ranked USC for their 4th national championship, and so many more. Saturday Legends is that game. What are you waiting for? Get in the game. Saturday Legends.
Get your copy at www.saturdaylegends.com.
Are you looking for a podcast network that talks Texas by Texans? Well, check us out. You're already listening to us, but go to the website, LoneStarPodcast.com. You can also find us on every big podcast platform. LSPN, we have shows in business, entertainment, marketing, music, of course, sports. We have some of the best sports podcasts in the state of Texas, ranging from high school football all the way up to pro basketball. So check us out online, LoneStarPodcast.com. That's the LSPN on every major podcast platform.
Now, the TLSN is not associated with the University of Texas. Instead, it is a free educational historical site that is highly insightful about some of those great University of Texas athletics stories. In this show, we take some of the great visuals, the great stories, the great history that is contained on TexasLSN.org, and we try to bring them to life. We bring them to life by adding the voices of the people involved in the stories, as well as the people who were there for those stories. Anytime you hear something on the TLSN show, rest assured you can find it on TexasLSN.org. On this extremely user-friendly site, you will find much more information about the stories we cover here in the show. We are combining the best of both worlds. You've got the detailed narrative on TexasLSN.org, and here you get the audio direct from those people involved. My job is to bring the stories from TexasLSN.org to life and do that with audio. Your job is to enjoy the stories you hear and then dig in over at TexasLSN.org. All right, everybody, join me in welcoming Professor Larry Carlson to the show. Larry, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great, Chris. Just excited to be with you and fired up to talk about Longhorns and anything we want to talk about.
I love it. So I mentioned Professor. First, I guess, tell us about that. Why am I calling you Professor?
I don't know, Chris, because nobody else ever did. I told my students for 35 years, just call me Larry, and it was pretty easy when I was only, a handful of years older than they were, but some of them were a little worried, once I turned into the Neanderthal old man, and they didn't want to address me by my first name, but taught at Southwest Texas, turned Texas State for 35 years. It's my old alma mater, and it was just a blast. Finally retired last summer, didn't want to do the online teaching, so, took retirement and having a blast doing that.
I love it, but our story is not a Bobcat story, it's a Longhorn story, so talk to me
correct.
About your youth, when you first became a Longhorn fan or even knew they existed.
Well, it was early on. I'm sure the first song I learned was not even Davy Crockett. It was The Eyes of Texas. My dad was UT class of 47, petroleum engineer. He went into the oil business, and he was from Elgin, just outside of Austin. We had relatives in Austin. Started taking me to games as soon as I was, cognizant enough to deserve it, which was 7 years old, 1960. And we went to about 3 games, the 5 home games per year back then, all my childhood through high school. And, it was a love affair. Chris, it's funny that one of your book titles is All I Need to Know I Learned from My High School Coach. Mm-hmm. I always liked that with the Longhorn roster. When we'd buy a game program, I would just memorize hometowns and jersey numbers, heights and weights, and it was a love affair from early on.
I love it. So tell me about growing up and how you got, associated with the Longhorns eventually.
Well, it was just, like I said, Daddy was, imbued us all. My sisters were older than I, and, but all of us were just, born into that orange blood that he had. Mm-hmm. And we kind of took it from there, going to all those games. And I always liked writing. By the time I was in even elementary school, sometimes I'd go to the office with my dad and, hunt and peck on the typewriter and type up my own versions of game stories after Texas had whipped the Aggies another time. And, I was doing that kind of stuff. And I was a junior high sports editor, and I worked on the yearbook, went to Robert E. Lee High School in my hometown of San Antonio. And the volunteers were just having great success back then, and had some players that went to Texas and one friend of mine later. So it was just, I was lucky, Chris, just born into Longhorns were tearing it up in the 60s, as you know, like nobody else. And Lee was doing the same thing on the high school front. So, it was just, I wanted to go into some kind of communication field. I ended up at Southwest Texas to try to play tennis. And that's why I didn't go to UT, but it turned out well for me. And I never stopped, sorry, I wasn't going to the Bobcats games. I was going to the Longhorns games. And that's what I did in baseball, basketball, and obviously football season. And didn't mean to be unfaithful to my school. It was just Texas was my first love, and it always has been.
Nice. And how did you get involved, as a career in media?
Well, I was, again, right place, right time. When I was a sophomore at Southwest Texas, I still want to call it Texas State now from all these years that I hadn't been doing that in the classroom. But there was a new professor came in, very young and invigorating guy named Sean McClanagan, and he started from scratch a broadcast program. And I was like, I'm jumping into this. That's even more up my alley than the print stuff. Mm-hmm. And he was a ball of energy, and we're friends to this day. He lives near Augusta, Georgia, near the Masters now. And he had so much energy and had so many contacts. And when I graduated, I got a job for 1 year in the San Marcos, Austin market. And the next year, something opened up at KVET, nice, which was number 1. And he told me about it. And I applied for the job and somehow got it. I was 24, living the dream, and I still am.
I love it. And at KVET, you started covering Longhorns.
That was it. I was sports director. I also did, I covered a little bit of everything. I had to go to the Capitol sometimes. I covered some murder trials and, those kind of things as well. But I was sports director and did 3 sportscasts every afternoon, did stories in advance for the next day, went to practice every day. And the greatest part was obviously football season, because I was hosting the Longhorn Locker Room show, post-game interviews, and then doing the Fred Akers pregame show the next year that I was there. We started doing that as well. So it was a dream come true for me, Chris.
Yeah, if you could kind of fill some people in who don't know about our business of media, the relationships you get to build with these programs. It's not like the average person, they watch on TV, they learn who a Fred Akers is, but you get to meet him, you get to hang with him, you get to make jokes with him.
Well, it was just, again, I really did. You hear that expression about I wanted to pinch myself. I felt that all the time. And, you get used to it a little bit, but you remind yourself, like, everybody in the world that I know would want my job, those kinds of things. And so it was just, I'd practiced kind of all my life, been auditioning for that kind of stuff, because I would kid around with my buddies in high school and do mock interviews and things like that, about all our sports that we were involved in. I was a tennis player, and most of my buddies were playing football for Lee. And we would do that kind of stuff. I would narrate my own, home baseball games, a little Stratomatic and stuff like that. So I felt like I knew how to interview people. And then once I went to college, I got to do it. And I was just set. I was so excited to meet those guys and that I'd been following. And so here I was, and all of a sudden these guys were a couple years younger than me. Earl Campbell, Brad Shearer, Randy McEachern, Russell Ertzleben. And I'm going to practice every day and getting to know these guys. And, Coach Akers, he was, I'm not going to say a tough interview, but Fred wasn't a happy-go-lucky backslapper, any of that kind of stuff with the media. You had to ask him the questions and do your job. And that's, that made it, a challenge that you had to be ready. I mean, Fred was one of those guys who could give you a stare. He wasn't like Greg Popovich, where he was, kind of feisty and angry with the media. It was just, you had to try to earn his respect, and hopefully I did, but he was not not an easy interview, but at the same time, Chris, practices were open back then. We talked to Fred, all the media, every day after practice. You could talk to the players before and after, and sometimes even during, if they were taking a water break. So I had free reign back then, and I'm telling you, I've got friends that are still out there covering it on a daily basis, and the access we had then was just, unparalleled. It was a dream if you were in our jobs in the media.
Definitely. And talk about some of the players that you got to know and give us some insight there.
Well, gosh, some of my favorites, and you got to be a Longhorn to know some of these guys, because some of them didn't get as many accolades,
right,
or at least haven't enjoyed them through the years. Lance Taylor was a linebacker from El Paso, and Lance was just a sophomore in 1977, and he'd been a blue-chip recruit, and he was all Southwest Conference as a sophomore middle linebacker, but he hurt his shoulder against A&M that year in a big blowout win that the Longhorns had, and he missed the Cotton Bowl. And a lot of people think that's why Texas lost to Notre Dame, that was one of the keys. Then Lance hurt his knee the next year against Houston, and it was just kind of never the same. But what a great, great guy. Randy McEachern with his Cinderella story coming on from third string in one game against OU. Randy was just, the friendliest, nicest, most patient guy. All of a sudden he was thrown into all this media hoopla, and he was just so gracious and kind and just a good guy. I was good friends with Russell Ertzleben. I went to his wedding. I was with him when he got drafted. Back then it was over the phone, even in the first round. And, those were the guys that stood out right off. And, I was having a blast.
Nice. And what about some of the other sports that you got to cover?
Well, basketball was just going like dynamite, Chris. Yeah. Abe Lemons, I guess, was in his maybe second or third year. And it was just like, wow, all the tectonic plates in the world had shifted, and Texas was back where it was supposed to be, because I came in right after that 5-5-1 season where Coach Royal resigned, and all of a sudden the Horns are number 1 and 11-0, and then in basketball they opened the new arena, which back then we called the Superdome, and the Irwin Center, and the Horns didn't lose there that whole year, and won the NIT, which was a huge accomplishment back then, because you only had 32 teams in the dance, and Texas was just going so well. And then, of course, baseball, Cliff Gustafson. They had one off year while I was there. Other times, it was standard operating procedure, which was you're going to win the conference and you're probably going to go to Omaha. So, I mean, even the other sports, Kevin Curran was one of the tennis players there. And a few years after I left, he was a Wimbledon finalist in singles and lost to Boris Becker. And Steve Denton had the fastest serve in college tennis, and then went on to have the fastest serve on the pro circuit. So you had just guys in every sport that were just absolute standouts.
Yeah, talk about a prime time for sports in UT history.
It really was. It was kind of like how things happened again, early this new century, and we had the Longhorns winning national championships in football and baseball in the same, time span, those kind of things. It was really, really going and cooking. So I got spoiled.
I love it. So I want to first talk about some of the toughest losses that you were witness to.
Wow. That's a great question, Chris, and I got to start with one of the toughest ones for anybody. This just shows me to be the 900-year-old man, but it's going to come up this fall. I was talking with my great buddy Kirk Bowles of the Austin American-Statesman. He's one of my best friends and has been since all this time. And Kirk and I were talking that this fall will be 60 years since Texas, in the next to the last game of the regular season, lost in a big upset to TCU 60-0 in Memorial Stadium. And there was a cheap shot by TCU. I don't mind saying that. Everybody saw it. It was reported. And Jimmy Saxton, the Longhorns All-America scatback, went down, and he tried to get up, and then he collapsed again. He came back and tried to play, but it was the upset of the year. Texas was number one, and TCU had won 2 games that year, and the Horns lost it. That one still hurts, and I'm sure it kept Texas from a national championship. They bounced back and shut out the Aggies. Then they beat a super Ole Miss team in the Cotton Bowl and finished up number 3. But that stands out. But, I was more recent vintage, that a legendary game. I was on the sidelines 20 feet from Michael Crabtree when he made that catch out in Lubbock in 2008. And that one, that was just a star-crossed game, because I think that team, Chris, was better than next year's team that, made it to the championship against Alabama with Colt getting hurt. They were just so good, but it was something in the air there in Lubbock. Crazy things happen out there. And the good news is 10 years later, in the same corner of the end zone, I was down there on the sidelines again there at the end of the game when Lil Jordan Humphrey made a leaping grab of a Sam Ehlinger pass, and the Horns pulled one out back in 2018. But those losses, that TCU loss and the Tech loss, those stand out. And, of course, I was there in the snow when Texas, 11-0, played Notre Dame after the 77 season. It was on January 2nd because the first was on a Sunday. And it snowed overnight in Dallas. We were freezing, and the Horns just didn't have it. Coach Akers said afterwards, memorably, I remember he just looked up at us and said, "You ever had a bad day, man? We had a bad day, man." That was it. Coach was just he was in shock like all of us. It was hard to find players that would talk after that game because 11-0, and here I was, my first year on the job. I'd never faced a loss in the locker room, Chris. So I remember Lance Taylor was hurt, as I mentioned, and I talked to Lance, because he'd been on the sidelines, and then, slowly gathered some of the other guys that were troopers out there, Mark Martinoni, Morgan Copeland. Those guys were great linebackers. Jim Yarbrough was a offensive lineman, so I kind of leaned on the guys that I really knew well because everybody in there was hurting so bad from that game.
Well, let's turn things brighter, and let's talk about some of the biggest wins?
Wow. Well, as just a fan, there were so many. In the early 60s, it was, the grind out games. And again, I'm speaking to the 100-year-old audience like myself, but the 62 Arkansas game that Texas won with a 90-yard drive in the closing minutes, and it beat Arkansas 7-3. That one still stands out. But there were so many. The Baylor game where Duke Carlisle intercepted the ball in the end zone in 63 to preserve what went on to be a national championship. And I got to tell you, this is my 10-year-old self, Chris. I was so convinced Texas just had it in the bag with a 7-point lead that with 2 minutes to go, I headed down to the locker room trying to scrounge something to write on to get autographs. I missed Carlisle's pick. I heard the roar. I knew the Horns were winning. Suddenly, these guys were coming down the stairs, whooping it up to the locker room, and I got Charlie Talbert's autograph on a ticket stub that I had from the knothole section, 50 cents for the game. So that was one that I saw that I loved. But all the games that I've seen the Horns beat the Aggies, those are just some of the sweetest ones. The 74 game, just as a fan, I was in college, and I don't know if you recall this one, Chris, or have read about it enough. You're too young, but that it was the first year that the Aggies were really building something under Emory Bellard, and Texas had lost to Baylor for the first time in about a century, and it was going to end the 6 years straight of going to the Cotton Bowl, winning the conference championship. So a lot of people thought the Aggies were going to load up and beat the Horns, and it was a very cold day in Memorial Stadium, and Texas jumped out to a 17-0 lead in the first 3 minutes, and beat the dog out of the Aggies 32-3. That stands out. Watching Peter Gardere and the 90 Shock the Nation tour when they beat A&M 28-27 at home. And I guess my favorite all-time one that I was working at was the 77 OU Texas game, because Texas had lost, they hadn't won since 1970. And they lost all those games and then tied Coach Royal's last season against OU, and there was all the Barry Switzer, cheating scandal stuff going on. And that game, in Texas, again, I mean, you can't draw up Cinderella anymore. Mark McBath went down with a knee injury. Then John Awney went down with a knee injury. And everybody's saying, who the heck is this third-string quarterback? Randy McEachern. And Randy was just so poised. And, of course, it's a good thing he had Earl Campbell to hand off to. You had just a defense that was, tough as nails. Brad Shearer went on to win the Outland Trophy. Johnny Johnson was All-America as a sophomore. And when they put that goal line stand on against OU in that game in the last 2 minutes, and it was Brad and Johnny combined on the stop on fourth down on Thomas Lott. I've got chills talking about it right now, because we had gone down to the sideline for the last few minutes, as you always do. And Bill Little, I saw tears rolling down his face. I guess he had begun to feel that, maybe the Horns were never going to beat Oklahoma again, and it was just such a relief to some of those people in the program when Texas stopped them. And then you still had to get out of the end zone. A couple plays went nowhere. Then Russell Erxleben, only he could do it. He boomed a 69-yard punt out of the end zone, and then Texas, won the game. I mean, that game was my first Texas OU game, Chris. And, they just don't get any better than that. I'll remember it forever and vividly, and just the smell of the corny dogs and the cotton candy in the air. That's what makes Texas OU like no other game.
I love it. And for the record, OU still sucks.
That's what they call the understood, right?
Right.
That's the part of the experiment that we all know.
Speaking of rivalries, what are your favorite rivalries throughout all this?
Well, gosh, as a kid, Texas-Arkansas was the biggest rivalry, in football, down in the Southwest. And so that was just gut-wrenching time every time that Texas played Arkansas. got to see, some of those games. And, of course, we all watched, the shootout, the game of the century, the 15-14 game. Then the next year, Texas played what I still think is the most perfect game ever. In 1970, beat Arkansas. It was pretty much the same teams, except we didn't have James Street. They still had Bill Montgomery, and Eddie Phillips led Texas, and it was 42-7 in Austin. And I always felt like that's what it should have been the year before, but Texas had a bunch of fumbles and was still able to overcome that. But that rivalry, and then in basketball, Texas-Arkansas, because that was Abe Lemons versus Eddie Sutton when I was working at KVET. And I don't know if you're familiar with this, Chris, or not, but I wrote an article that's now on the TLSN website about Abe versus Eddie, and they nearly came to blows. At halftime of the game, we were all just getting up to go get a Coke from you're down there by the scorer's table and all that. And all of a sudden we saw Coach Lemons and Coach Sutton, men in suits and ties trying to, go at each other and swing, and players stepped in and broke them up. And we were like, what in the heck is going on? And so we had to wait until after the game to find out. And it was the first time Texas had lost in the Superdome in almost the 2 years they've been playing there. And Arkansas won that game. Texas beat them up in Fayetteville, so it was kind of payback. But Coach Lemons was just livid because he felt like that Coach Sutton had spoken to one of the Horn players, Johnny Moore, as he came off the floor at the end of the first half. And Coach Lemons went on a tirade. I mean, we were biting our lips because it was funny, and the country expressions that he used. Well, one of the only things I can say, because everybody was looking at each other like, wow. The newspaper guys thought, I can't print this. And I was thinking, we're going to have to bleep all this. But the last thing he said about Sutton was, he goes, if he ever says another thing like that, I'll tear his Sunday clothes.
I love it.
Yeah, it was just, Abe Lemons was, he had that gift of gab, and you didn't need to ask questions. We got pretty lazy as media members because you just got out your scribble pad or your turned on your microphone and just let him go. And he was always entertaining, and that was something else. So that was a great rivalry. But the Aggie stuff, it grew and grew, and wow, those games, the OU games, the Arkansas games, they all stand out.
Nice. I love that. Take us now after your KVET, after your coverage of the Longhorns. What was the transition to becoming a professor?
Well, it was kind of strange. I got injured in an accident. I got hit coming back from doing a story. I got hit by a drunk driver out on I-35. Back then, they didn't have all the barricades they have now. It was just a bunch of oleander trees, so I never saw what hit me, but woke up in the hospital a couple of days later, and I had a paralyzed vocal cord among a lot of other injuries, so I couldn't talk. So I was kind of like, well, there goes the broadcasting. What else can I do? It took about a year and a half to recover from the other injuries, but I was blessed in so many ways just to survive, a high-speed accident like that. But then I went to the Cleveland Clinic and was kind of had my voice restored. So I worked as the first sports information director at the University of Texas at San Antonio. Did that for a while. Then I got into some magazine work. And then my buddy Kirk Bowles that I mentioned before with the Statesman, Kirk was teaching part-time at Southwest Texas, and a job came open in the broadcast area, and he said, why don't you get Larry? He went here, and so they called me, and I did that for a year. Then, miraculously, it's kind of like the story of my life, just good blessings. They had a full-time opening after I'd done that 1 year, so I got the job and ended up doing it for 35 years and still getting to do a bunch of other sports things, radio in San Antonio, covered the Oilers camps back in the day when they were in San Marcos 3 straight years for AP Radio. I did some ESPN radio in San Antonio on the Longhorn Pipeline back in the glory days of Colt McCoy and beyond that. So just a lot of fun and a lot of things like that. But teaching was it was a treat and a joy.
Nice. Well, one of the blessings that I personally have had with running Lone Star Gridiron Texas high school football is our internship and training program, where we've got like 20, 30 people who learned this business and now work in media. I assume as a teacher there, as a professor, you've now got people all over who, learned under you.
That is the probably the most rewarding thing, Chris, as you just stated. I mean, to see, it always kind of made me feel like I was a little bit of a coach, and you were watching your players move on. And, I inherited some wealth there, just guys that, I don't know if I taught them a darn thing or not, but they still give me credit. But Mike Ciccarello to this day is one of my best buddies. And he's been director of broadcasting for the San Antonio Spurs now for more than 25 years. There's a guy named Chris Summer that a lot of people in the DFW area know. He's been in Dallas radio for about 30 years. Those guys, right off are just absolute all-stars. But, yeah, there are people everywhere. I've got a buddy who's been in Birmingham for many years, covering, both the Tide and the Auburn Tigers there. And, they're all over the place. And it's just fun to see. And then a lot of the guys have transitioned into different areas of media, same way as I did. Guys have shown versatility going from print to broadcast to print. And, of course, everybody's having to do all the digital things. And I was talking just this afternoon to one of my students who graduated just this past year. And of all places, he just moved to do a sports and production job in Bismarck, North Dakota. So a little bit of a change from, the Texas Friday Night Lights to a show that he's doing up there called Friday Night Lights.
I love it. Well, Professor Larry Carlson, I want to thank you so much for sitting down with me, sharing some fascinating UT history and your personal history.
Oh, it's been my pleasure, Chris. I mean, getting to talk about the Longhorns to anybody that'll listen, I appreciate you putting up with me on it. It's just, I've gotten so much out of following the Horns and then getting to meet some of the guys that were idols of mine when I was a kid, Ted Coy, Steve Wooster, people like that. And, to get to deal with people like Billy Dale, the guys that, you were idolizing when you saw them score the winning touchdown and things like that. It's just, it never stops. It's a gift that keeps on giving.
I love it. Once again, I want to thank Larry Carlson for sitting down with me and sharing some of his amazing history as it relates to University of Texas athletics. Thank you for listening. Please do us a favor and share this episode out with other people so that we can get this in front of more folks. This collaboration between the Texas Legacy Support Network and the Lone Star Podcast Network is one of the favorite things I get to do these days. I love sharing these stories out on the top Texas-based podcast network. I love working with the message that the Texas Legacy Support Network sends. Please go over to their website, texaslsn.org, for more detail about each of the people we mention in these shows, including great photos. But this show is just the tip of the iceberg. Over at texaslsn.org, there is so much more University of Texas athletics information on the site. And their mission is a great one. That's texaslsn.org. And if you want to help make sure that we are able to tell these stories, to bring these to more people, we are looking for sponsorship. Yes, if you have a business or a message you want to get in front of this rabid, loyal fan base, reach out to me, Chris Daly, 713-269-4643. 888-888-4620, and I will get you all set up. Or if you even know somebody who might be interested, get them in touch with me. And as always, you can find out more about any of these stories over at the website texaslsn.org. That's the Texas Legacy Support Network, texaslsn.org. It is jam-packed with stories like these and tons of other great stories about UT athletics. And as always, keep reaching for the stars and don't stop till you get there.